Hello, everyone. Richard Stock here, longtime supporter of buying legal counsel and battle-scarred veteran over the last 20 plus years of negotiating long-term agreements with law firms on behalf of companies, procurement and legal departments. So our plan today is to share a few ideas about managing the cost of legal services. And to do that, I'm also going to refer at the front end of it to the part of the costs being the internal legal costs. And so this will span total legal spend. This will be the legal department, but most of the focus will be on external legal costs. We've got 4 steps today on this first slide. So just to let you know what we're going to try to cover. The first part will be on intake control and insourcing. And these are important sequences as well in how we look to manage the costs. Forecasting and managing the demand for legal services. 7 steps to manage costs. I figured 8 was too many, and most folks can manage to memorize up to 7 steps. And then a small bit at the very end on performance targets and its relationship to managing the cost of legal services. So when we look at then as our first category of discussion, we're looking at how to manage really capacity of the company to handle its own legal work. And one of the first pieces of advice is to create new capacity out of existing resources. And so some of the tools that we use to do that are the introduction of protocols for business units to use about when to call legal and when to not call legal. Have to step away these days from having folks just on standby in legal departments, a little bit like they are in law firms, and basically to give much clearer guidance around when legal should be called and at what stages for different types of purposes, whether that's litigation, transactions, labor and employment, regulatory work, and so on. And so that tends to mean that we would introduce restrictions on the intake of routine work and questions. Legal departments are a resource that's time limited, that has to do with deal with a certain amount of unforeseen work, unforeseen crises, unforeseen opportunities. And so it's natural that legal departments, after more than 20 years now, have evolved to a place where they have to be considered a specialized resource and begin to move away seriously from intake of routine work and routine questions. We also, with part of intake, limit the number of individuals who can call legal. You would be surprised as to how many legal departments have open door policies. These are electronic open doors. Clearly, nobody walks to legal departments anymore. But I think then a serious limitation to all business units, and I'm not talking about the C-suite here, but everybody else in the organization that is in constant communication with legal departments. So limiting the contact list, identifying responsible lawyers for each business unit, even though those individuals don't do all the legal work. This is equivalent to, if you will, an account manager. And they are the ones who manage the relationship with the business unit. Not unusual that that would overlay with the legal specialization for most of what such business units would need. After some number of years of recommending these kinds of protocols, intake protocols, what we have found upon further analysis is that that can have the effect of reducing internal demand by up to 25%. And that becomes quite interesting for most legal departments for a reason that you'll begin to see on the next slide. And here, in terms of creating capacity, I mean, I referred to capacity of up to 25%. We're talking here about the possibility of generating as much as 8 or so additional hours a week of capacity on work weeks that in our studies are averaging 45 to 50 hours as the average work week for in-house counsel and their staff. And so you're looking there at about 400 additional hours of capacity. What do you do with that? if it's not a clear plan, then again, our observation is that failure to insource to fill that 400 hours in a structured way, failure to insource will simply mean that it'll fill up with the usual, and at the end of the day, everybody will say, where did my day go? So the advice there is to insource or co-counsel at least only complex work from law firms. Perhaps that means you change the configuration of your legal team, you change the specialization mix, but clearly, if you're looking at average rates of complex work, you're anywhere, depending on your region and type of work, averaging $400 an hour and more. And when we know that the fully loaded cost of internal counsel is about 45% of external for the equivalent capabilities, then you're saving 55 cents on the dollar. And that's the first thing you've got to do to save and manage cost of external counsel. And that is essentially, that's to give out less work and do essential complex work internally. Let's go to the second category of conversation here. Again, this is all part of preparation for managing the cost of legal services. You would, again, perhaps not be surprised to find that very few companies will prepare an annual forecast of the total demand for internal and external legal services for each business unit and corporately or globally as well. That annual forecast is expressed by category of work, by complexity mix of the work, and of course by total hours estimated, with a split then between internal and external referred work. This forecast should be documented, and it should be shared with the various business units as an estimate. And that's useful because that helps business units become more aware of, and the organization as a whole, of consumption patterns. We then expect that the responsible lawyer for that business unit will be held accountable to manage that demand and manage the exceptions and variances around that, rather than simply be receiving and trying to deal and cope with demand as it happens. Just-in-time inventory management simply is not enough. And so the idea of managing this demand is not so much as a rule, but as a series of expectations that have to be shared, that have to be managed, and frankly, in the belief that what gets measured gets done. Now, that doesn't require timekeeping in the legal department. These estimates are based on experience as well as relationships and some review of the matters that are opened up in the legal department. Our estimate of managing this against a forecast is that about 8 to 10% of time can be saved, and most of that time is basically avoiding time lost in meetings that prove not to be especially useful. Let's go to the last piece. This is the last piece in terms of steps. And these are a sequence really that are quite important to respect by way of trying to manage your cost of legal services. If we can just go back up one slide, we'll see that the first step really is a single word that describes what I covered earlier, insourcing. And so the first way, of course, if you're by each lawyer, for each lawyer, if roughly 400 hours are insourced, every 5 lawyers you've saved a considerable amount, the equivalent of a whole lawyer and staff. And so insourcing is the first step, and the one that should be carefully reviewed and carefully managed against quarterly targets. The second thing in the steps to manage costs is to look at the practice management habits of the members of your legal team, and to introduce practice protocols. I mean, if you gather up 10 lawyers in the legal department of all different specialties and experience levels, you will find that you have a collection of solo practitioners with practice management habits that are all over the map. And in that sense, a law department is not like a law firm. It's not a captive law firm where you've got good leverage, where you've got seniors and juniors working together, that you've got good practice in delegations. Internally, what you'll find, again, after mind-numbing analysis, up to 90% of the hours on individual matters that are managed internally are done by that one lawyer. There's very, very little evidence of delegation. And so that's not always the most effective technique. One would have to rethink staffing ratios in legal departments, and that brings us to then what one does in the step of staffing ratios by legal specialty for external counsel. This requires some research in terms of the staffing patterns of different law firms by category of legal work. And what we're looking to do is to try and influence those staffing habits in law firms. That's done through a variety of steps that might include requests for proposals with staffing protocols. Our experience is that staffing ratios by legal specialty negotiated with law firms will save up to 15% in the effective rate of the services received from those law firms. Again, it's easier to do that, not on a matter-by-matter basis, but with multi-year portfolios of legal work for external counsel. This means that one will move beyond multi-year panels into bundling work in critical mass amounts for external counsel for a limited number of firms by category of work, by region. And by doing that, and without making guarantees of a certain amount of work, but estimates of work for external counsel that are shared with those firms, one will find that staffing protocols are easier to introduce with those firms, and that firms will work to plan more easily. If we can go to the slide, the next slide, please. And you'll forgive me for a second while I take a little drink here of my tea in my Campbell Soup cup. There we go. Thanks, Andy Warhol. Managing on a matter-by-matter basis is, of course, part of the daily grind of controlling and managing costs. And so one of the companion pieces to managing costs is managing the cost of individual matters, especially matters that begin to have more than 50 hours. They are at that threshold beginning to have a level of complexity that is worth managing. You know, an extra, 10% is an extra 5 hours. And when you get into estimates of matters, then one should know more about the cost, the projected costs of those legal matters, whether they're litigation or transactions. Law firms these days all have capability for legal project management, for estimates by phases and tasks, which should be reviewed at the very outset of these matters as they're assigned to external counsel. Again, that tool is practical and has an effect, both a controlling and a deterrent effect on the number of hours that external counsel work by type of matter, and also on the delegation that and the ratio of staffing which controls the effective rate. And these are reviewed typically within a couple of weeks of the matter being assigned to the firm. They've got a matter and project budget back. I think it's good practice on our second to last step to manage costs. It's good practice to issue a request for proposal or an invitation for strategic partnering every 3 to 5 years. And this is for portfolios of work as opposed to individual matters. If this means a panel refresh, that's fine, but it does rely on some scope of work estimates, some preparation in terms of staffing and work patterns of law firms, as well as acceptance of the other protocols and pricing arrangements. And our last step, of course, to manage costs is to create an alignment of fee arrangements. Clearly, we know that hourly-based fee arrangements are persistent. They've been around for well more than 45 years. They tend to represent in their variations, hourly, blended rates, and so on. Hourly does up to 85% of all the legal work that's put out there. And so hourly based fee arrangements are not an incentive for a law firm to do less work, to do better delegation, to be more efficient. And so those are all the things that a client would want. And so moving to non-hourly fee arrangements is a solid technique, one of the pieces in the toolbox to manage the external counsel costs. Alternative fee arrangements are the topic of another presentation another day, but not to be forgotten as part of our 7 steps to manage costs. Our last category of conversation to manage costs is to set performance targets. And these can be both financial and non-financial. For our purposes today, we'll talk about the financial ones. The non-financial include performance related to results, to innovation, to effectiveness. But a straightforward one in terms of a performance target that's financial would be to share 50% of the savings with firms as measured against the annual total of detailed matter budgets. In other words, in a partnering arrangement for purposes of managing the cost of legal counsel, how accurate firms are to staying within approved budgets matter by matter, and then cumulatively staying within the overall budget, because there'll be overruns on some matters and shortfalls on other matter budgets. But overall, at the end of the year and on a year-over-year basis, a firm should be rewarded. This should be a symmetrical risk-sharing, risk-reward arrangement. But I've seen so few and not enough performance targets set with legal business partners, with law firms, where 50% of the savings are shared with firms. And if we can go to our last working slide. It would be important, it would be important, I think, to also tie performance targets for inside counsel who have to manage the workflow, who have to review the budgets, and who are accountable for the cost of legal services. And so I have seen examples where counsel that are briefing, that are assigning work to external counsel, so in-house counsel that are doing that, have part of their compensation tied to how well the demand forecasts are met and how legal budgets for business units are managed, especially against external counsel. My sense in this sort of quick recipe, there's a lot that understates it, that's more than just adding water to make the instant pudding, but if you do all of these things well over time, over a couple of years, then our evidence is that total legal spend will be reduced by up to 20% over projected legal spend, with almost no reliance on obtaining greater discounts. Now, this requires preparation, vigilance, collaboration internally with business units and with law firms. But our belief and experience with our corporate clients is that done well, done consistently, with enough effort and good data, and with the support and collaboration between procurement and legal, those objectives can be met. Thanks for your time today, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy this work and find something like this to do in the years to come.